Hey, Chikwe, thank you very much. And Ike, I mean, remarkable work you've done to put together a meeting like this today, and may your elbow forever move freely, sir. You know. And Audrey, I do remember also with one of your comments on cultural thoughtfulness of my forebears, but I remember taking a group of energy ministers from the SADC up to Victoria Falls for a retreat after a conference, and we went down to have a look at the falls and things, and there of course is this great big statue to Stanley, the man of course who discovered the Victoria Falls. And we all stood there looking at it thinking, okay, you know, and then the Zimbabwean guy said, well, history, you know, we'll put it down to history, you know, therefore we'll abide by it. But I also remember, and always sort of have a little giggle, because Lake Nyasa and Nyasa Land, again, which was also remarkably named, was when Stanley came across up above the mountainside and he looked down upon this wonderful expanse of water, and he asked his right-hand man, he said, and what do you call this water? And the guy said, Nyasa. So he said, okay, this will be Nyasa, the Lake Nyasa. What he didn't realize, of course, was Nyasa meant lake. So, Oyimbo, he know nothing. Oh. Anyway, so thank you indeed. And my thoughts are really sort of observations of hope, observations of the development of community, in that it is my view that it is actually community that can actually move forward progress. Government can enable, but it's actually up to us, it's up to people, it's up to individuals, it's up to communities, ultimately, in what we can achieve. Now, I'll start off with a little example back in my own home territory in a little village up in Cambridgeshire. And about 10, 12 years ago, we were suddenly faced with the loss of our pub. Now, in English life, the village pub is, of course, a very important part of life. And it was the last pub, the only pub in the village. All we had was a church, and we had 120 dwellings, a church, and that was it. And suddenly, the whole house prices had moved up massively, and the landlord thought he could make himself a lot more money by actually selling the property rather than as a residential dwelling, rather than carrying on as a pub, which was struggling a bit, but it was still a very good place. And a few of us said, well, hey, you know, this is crucial to our culture in many respects. I mean, otherwise we'll be coming to 120 individual houses, because in Britain, of course, no one talks to each other. You know, you sit in the trains, you sit in the tube, and everyone's sitting there to look. Unlike in Africa, of course, with a much more open atmosphere. Anyway, so as such, as good villagers, we decided that we better revolt as good peasants. And so we formed a committee and we called a public meeting, and we in the end, I mean, to cut a long story short, what happened in the end was that we set up a company, which was called, the village is called Reach, so we called the company Reach for a Pint Limited. And we challenged the government law, because at that time in the planning, there was no protection for pubs, no protection for shops. And yet, actually, for our community, they were critical. If we lost everything, we lost the shop in the previous property boom, if we lost the pub, what was left? Anyway, so we fought, and we made representations to the Department of Environment, as it was then. I think it's DEFRA now, whatever. And in the end, we changed UK planning law. There's purely a few of us who put our time out, and now if you're the last pub in a village, or your last shop in a village, or your last petrol station in a village, if there is a viable alternative to keep it running, it is protected. And I just use that as an example of something that where, as a group, as people, if there's something that's important to your community, you can change it, you can do it. And I now actually find, we actually had Prince Charles, bless him, he actually helicoptered the village to thank us, because he now runs something called the Pub is the Hub. And the Pub is the Hub, I now am the one of the peasant members of it, and we counsel other pubs all over the country that are facing closure. I mean, now we have something like 380 post offices in pubs in Britain. We have a lot of pubs now that are actually producing school meals. So we're diversifying and finding ways and means to keep things going. So I use that as an example, not obviously of what can happen in Nigeria or in Africa generally, but of what people can do individually should they wish. Now, my background, as you've gathered, was Nigeria. My father was there for many, many years. But And obviously, with my professional life, I publish Africa Health and have done that now by accident, actually, for 31 years. Since it was launched at the time I came on the job market. And I was only intending to be there for a couple of years, but actually I'm still there. And grandly, it said I bought it from Reed Elsevier. Actually, the truth was they actually paid me to take it away because they didn't know what to do with it back in the mid-'80s. And we've kept going somehow, some way. But it's never been easy. It's always been fun. It's always been a bit of a struggle. Africa Confidential, terrific. I mean, great fun. I mean, the kudos for that is with Patrick Smith, not myself, but Patrick was the long-term editor and got a chance to buy it when Blackwell's merged with Wiley. And so, as old mates, he came and said, Bryan, look, let's try and take it forward. And we've now launched Africa Asia Confidential as well, tracking the huge changes in the continent. And that's where I really want to start this talk, really, is that there's been two big changes in the last 15 years, I think, in Africa. One has been the arrival of the Chinese. It's phenomenal. And I've just come back, actually, from a trip through South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Kenya. Just got back 2 days ago. And I've been traveling around a lot elsewhere. It's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal, the arrival of the Chinese. Now, that's great in many respects. They've reduced prices. They've caused a lot of the West to rethink some of their policies and ideas and conditionalities and whatever. But at the same time, quite what's happening? In Zimbabwe, have the crown jewels gone? We don't know. No one's quite sure what's happening. But China and their arrival in Africa is a phenomenal change in the last 15 years. The other major change that I think that's come forward that I've seen traveling up and down the continent is the arrival of civil society. And that has changed a huge amount and it changed a lot of what can be achieved, I think, in Africa. No longer are governments quite as strong, as powerful, as all singing, as all dancing as they used to be. And I think what we've got to do somehow is try to harness that whole development of civil society and find ways of how that could help us move forward and progress. I am, as I said, my father's son. He was a wonderful guy. He ran this hospital at Elisha. He went there in 1952. And really he spearheaded a child health revolution in many respects. What they realized was that they had a huge burden of disease, of cases in the pediatric wards, all, well not all, largely preventable. And rather than just keep on trying to deal with the often late arrival of patients and the deaths pursuant, he and a few other doctors thought, look, come on, we ought to be able to go out and prevent a lot of these diseases. And in those days, this was still a fairly early concept. So they managed to raise some funding, and from some rather reluctant British guy in the West African Medical Research Council, as it was called at the time. And they got the guy called Professor David Morley to come out, who did half-time clinical work in the hospital. And half-time he set up this epoch-making research centre up at a village called Ebesi Ile, where they proved that actually just by using grade 2 level midwives, well-trained, nurtured, well looked after, they could actually cut the infant mortality by a factor, huge factor, by over, I'm not sure what the percentages were, but at that time the longitudinal studies were showing that over half the kids were not reaching the age of 5. And that's terrible. And they found that actually by just a very, very, very basic introduction of public health measures, they introduced the measles vaccine. I'm glad to say my father, in those days, there was no ethics about research and things. There was no ethical boards and stuff. So he insisted that his kids had the measles vaccine as well when it was being tested. So I have this little claim to fame that I was the first white boy to have the measles vaccine. We all got measles, actually. It was slightly too strong in those days, but they had to send it back. And not badly, I hasten, but I always think that was a very fine gesture of his. But from that study, really primary health care in many respects was born, which is something that is coming back on stream again now. But growth charts, which are now used universally, were started at that hospital in Elisha. They managed to persuade Awolowo, who was then the fairly new and young governor of the Western region, to help fund the project. He paid them 3 shillings, paid the hospital 3 shillings per patient. So they had free treatment for the under 18 the under 5 kids and up to the under 18 age group. And they proved that actually you could change huge amounts. Such was the success that the population of MSc-ILE started growing by 9% per annum. And there then brought the very first family planning, as it was called then, reproductive health, if you like, services that were started also there because they had to respond to the success they were having. But so it was an amazing upbringing. It was a privileged upbringing I had, because obviously we had a lot of international people flowing through. We had also inspiring people. We had Olukoya Kuti, for instance. I mean, what a wonderful man, coming through, working very closely in the hospital as well. But I suppose what happened was my father taught me community. I mean, it was never quite the sort of son, I want to talk to you about the birds, bees, and community. But it was just something innate and human within him that has its long-lasting effect, if you like. So the revolution that in many ways was started at Arusha actually didn't continue, unfortunately, in Nigeria. Many other countries took it up. When primary healthcare was launched after a seminal conference at Alma-Ata in 1978, and primary healthcare was launched internationally, in Nigeria it didn't work. There was no real proper take-up from the medical fraternity. It was tried to run in divorce. It was sort of run as a sort of a separate sort of service. I remember I got into big trouble because there was one big contract run by a UK company to provide the equipment for lots of, there was a sort of 300 and something health centres. And I wrote this story in Africa Health saying that, look, this is stupid because, I mean, they're sending out all this equipment, container by container by container, including ashtrays, can you believe? I mean, but times have moved on. But the idea was each container was going to be a health centre. But no one had thought about power or water or, you know, slightly useful little structures. And so, of course, these things went out and they either just disappeared to other people who picked them up and used them, or they decayed and became useless. And alas, to report, you know, primary healthcare in Nigeria never really took off and never really worked. My father now, I mean, he was, after working at Arusha, he then moved on to run the external campus at University of Ibadan, and sort of teaching all the students in 6 weeks in public health work. And then he set up postgraduate GP training. Now, GPs in Nigeria now, I mean, they're growing in numbers, but I was amazed down in Oshogbo not so long ago to find actually the GPs, rather than actually working as GPs in the way we would like to see them working and getting out in their communities, they were put into outpatients in the teaching hospitals because no one quite knew what they should be doing. They didn't fit properly. And we've got to find a way forward. Now, I can remember my father, I mean, we used to originally go down by boat, because it was before aeroplanes. And although I don't really remember the boat journeys too well, but I'm told actually one little sort of anecdotal point that Awolowo actually was on one of the journeys going back, and he travelled in first class, and my parents and family, we were all in the cattle. But Awolowo apparently he used to organise drafts tournaments, so he'd come back to the cattle class, as it were, and organise these drafts tournaments among the passengers, and he won always apparently. I'm not sure there's any money involved or whatever, but anyway. Now, running around Africa and organising meetings and conferences as well as publishing, I'm also quite savvy enough to know that I must always have good people working with me, because Oyinbo, you can be a little bit sort of vulnerable sometimes if you do things wrongly, or if someone suspects you might be doing something different. And it's been a fascinating world, actually. But in Kenya, for instance, I have a guy called Joe Alawach. Now, Joe he's a senior doctor. He's a wonderful guy. He's Order of the Burning Spear, the highest offering in Kenya. But intriguingly, I just saw him actually only last week, and it's quite topical at the moment because his wife has been elected. She was a Supreme Court judge in Kenya, and she's been elected to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And of course, at the moment, there's major issues, which I'll come on to shortly, actually, in Kenya over the post-election violence and things. But amazingly, Joe, I mean, he can sort anything, but he says now he's got all these senior politicians, because his wife knows Moreno Campo, the head of the ICC. They're all ringing him saying, "Hey, Joe, can you help us, please?" You know, it's extraordinary. Of course, he just laughs at them, but it's interesting. And Tlan, my man in Harare, I mean, he's an amazing guy again. he's managed to last out all the problems of the last 10 years, a lost decade, as many of them talk of it. And yet he's managed to do so by being quite outspoken, but taking it from the business community. He's managed to avoid being involved in the political side of things. But as such, you know, he's got this sort of fine tribute that Mugabe himself knows him well. He's sat on many committees with him, and he's managed to get himself a sort of a position where everyone respects him from all sides. He knows whether it's MDC or it's ZANU, but because Mugabe has actually said, I don't want to appoint him as a minister because I'll spoil him. And that's a great position to get yourself into in a very tricky political world. In Libya, our man there, he actually he's the private physician to the man in the tent, to Gaddafi. And again, we were organising a conference there once, and we were sort of working late, opening next day, setting up the exhibition, and suddenly this man tapped me on the shoulder and said, Bryan, Mr. Pearson, rather, have you a license to run this meeting? And I said, care? What? And then they tried to close it down. But fortunately, it's always important. I was able to call Ibrahim, and so the man from the Chamber of Commerce, he was like 10 of clubs, you know, and Ibrahim was sort of Jack of diamonds. So he was able to say, no problem, and on we went. In Nigeria for many years, alas, he's passed now, but Berko Ransom Kuti was our very close friend and ally. And one of my sons even is named after him. There's very few Beko Lalaris in this world, but Berko, again, in terms of signs of hope, you know, what does Berko mean? Olukoye translated it once to me. He said that Beko Lalari, it means to be honourable is something to be chuffed about. Now, various people have slight differences in translation, but hey, that's something that we should all be aiming for. And but what a family that was, you know, to just chat on. I mean, Olukoye was to the very, very top. And it was so sad to lose such a fine man. But fella, you know, I mean, what a man as well. And I actually had the extraordinary time when at one point, I mean, fella, I mean, you know, what a chaotic man as well. And dear fella, you know, he'd had all these contracts over the years. I mean, he'd been with Decca, he'd been with Parlophone, he'd been with Chrysalis, he'd been with every recording company you could name. And was there a contract? It was all on the back of a cigarette packet every time, you know. So we got to a point when there was sort of two managers, one in France and one in Italy. And there was the family, and there was fella, he just didn't really mind. But Motown were offering big money for the back catalogue, and there was this sort of impasse. And I foolishly said, because I knew the managers a bit, and I knew the family, and I said, look, I'll try and see if I can mediate on all this. And so in the end, we were trying to sort out, a lot of people were bootlegging his music in different parts, so we were slowly trying to pull it all together. And it was coming together quite nicely. And then we hit one final little intransigent point, and in the end, I had to ask the managers, I said, look, you need to give me all the master discs for fella's music, because you can't negotiate when you've got those in your control. So this great trunk delivered to my house one day, and you know, it contained all of fella's music, the original tapes. And so I feel like I held it in escrow while we were trying to carry on the negotiations and things. I used to walk past it every now and then, and you know, $1 million, you know. Anyway, it was an extraordinary situation, and we nearly got things solved, and then alas, fella died. It was so sad. But what a family, what an experience, what a time. Now, for those aficionados of Match of the Day and Match of the Day 2, and of course, we've got a little football tournament coming up, which of course none of you, I'm sure, had any doubt about Nigeria qualifying. Act of God times 2 in the 83rd minute. But I'm going to just come up with a few little thoughts, and those who know the programme, they have this sort of 3 good, 3 bad, or whatever at the end, and show a few things. And just in generality of Africa, let me just pull a few thoughts together and then conclude. I'll start with 3 bad. And 1 is impunity, 1 reliance, and 1 dodgy religion. And Africa-wide at the moment, I'm very worried, in many respects, by this word impunity. We've had this governance issues, we've had the corruption issues, we've had the problems of that aspect. But there's a slowly growing little level of possible impunity that's coming forward that I think is something that we should all be very concerned about. We see it with the situation from Darfur and Bashir from Sudan. We see it in Kenya in many respects, and I think the mention was made of Kenya. You know, much of actually the violence that emerged after the election last time was not to do with the election, it was actually tribal violence. And I mean, even now, I'm told that people are digging in for the next time. So, at the moment, the Kenyans were asked, look, solve your problem, set up tribunals. It's absolutely obvious from all the reports who was responsible and who therefore needs to be called to account. And of course they couldn't come up with a final solution of some sort to actually hear the problems because of the divisiveness within the community. Quick change, you now just quickly look down to Tanzania, where Nyerere, of course, had his long-time revolution. And Tanzanians, they believe they're Tanzanians. It's amazing how in Kenya, it's very tribal. In Tanzania, there's as many different tribes, but they actually view themselves as Tanzanians. Interesting. But in Kenya, there's a serious problem. I mean, and obviously, Marino Ocampo, the ICC judge, has been down. He has opened the envelope, obviously, that Kofi Annan said would be opened if the Kenyans didn't resolve the problem themselves. And I'm afraid it goes to the top. We don't know exactly who's on all the names on the list, but there is Uhuru Kenyatta, there's William Ruto, there's George Saitoti. There's some senior ministers on that list. What's going to happen? I fear that actually when push comes to shove, that the government's going to find it very hard actually to give up their own people to a further trial. And that's problematical because that will bring huge negatives to the people of Kenya, who will be the ultimate sufferers as aid and funding and investment could be jeopardized. In Zambia at the moment, there's a serious problem in the Ministry of Health. All the donors have pulled out entirely. And again, a lot of people are in jail who've been implicated, who've been charged, who've been tried. But the senior members, they somehow have managed to stay above the point. We look at the latest issue of Africa Confidential, which unfortunately I haven't got copies of, I've got a photocopy of, but the latest issue, which came out only yesterday. But we got hold of the indictment on Abba Abacha and the actual case there, and led with that story. And again, you know, how I wonder, how can a Chaguris, for instance, you know, I mean, you know, he gave back, was it $60 million that he'd borrowed inadvertently, you know. Yeah, how do people stay in a society at the level of the Chaguris with the Echo hotels and everything else when they've been so severely implicated? It's hard to know. Impunity, number one. Number two, reliance. I'll try and keep things moving. Reliance, I think, again, there's a lot of aid money going into Africa. I think we've got to start channeling it more to civil society groups rather than to directly into governments. I think the systems in government are still not strong enough, and I think civil society actually now in its merging form can actually change things much better. Religion, dodgy religion. Dodgy joke, why are Indians no good at football? Dodgy joke, but it's in its context. Hopefully you'll let me off. The answer is whenever they get a corner, they open a shop. Now, in Nigeria, what's happening? Everywhere, churches. And it's worrying because there are some very good churches, of course, but there are a lot of churches that really are just there for earning money and for exploiting the poor. Somehow we've got to get an address on that issue. In Zimbabwe, for instance, what they have there is a system whereby only official churches are allowed in buildings. You can actually hold meetings outside, prayer meetings, whatever, but only people who are qualified are allowed actually even to read from the Bible. But as such, they've managed to somehow, if you like, curtail the entrepreneurial aspect of religions. Okay, three goods. The middle classes are back. I think that's very big. Am I running over? Yeah. Right. Primary healthcare is back, and events like this. I think the focus of the middle class has been back, has meaning a lot of people actually are feeling they're able to stay rather than they're feeling they must run. There's doctors, nurses, teachers who weren't going back 10 years ago are feeling they can be back and they can have ambition for their kids and things, and that's great. Jumping on, time, you don't realise, do you, how fast time's moving. The overall message that I wanted to bring is that with through community, we can indeed all make a difference. But community has to override self. And I think that's a key point that we've still got to really address within the Nigerian cycle. Whereas in my little community in Cambridge, the pub is the hub. You know, we've still got too much rub is the hub, too much money is the dominant force. If we look at China, we look at Malaysia, we look even at Ghana. You know, a lot of these countries have moved on perhaps ahead in terms of equitable societies than perhaps we've managed so far in Nigeria. And the challenge, I think, in creating an equitable society is acute, and in many respects, our peaceful future depends upon it. Thank you.